There is a generation that no one talks about. Not the boomers who reshaped the world and never let you forget it. Not the millennials who were handed a crisis and turned it into a cultural identity. Not Gen Z, who arrived already fluent in the language of self-awareness and collective grief. I'm talking about the people born between 1965 and 1975. The ones who grew up in the gap. The ones who were told in 1,000 quiet ways that their timing was wrong, that they had arrived either too late or too early, depending on who you asked. If you were born in those years, or if you love someone who was, this video is for you. Because what I want to explore today is not just a demographic footnote, it is a psychological portrait. And it is one of the most quietly painful ones I know. Every generation gets a name, a story, a set of defining wounds and defining gifts that the culture holds up and says, "This is who you are." The boomers got the post-war boom, the counterculture, the sense of having remade the world from the inside. The millennials got the internet, the financial crisis, the participation trophies, and the therapy speak and the endless think pieces about their feelings. Gen X, the slightly older cohort, got the latchkey childhood, the cynicism, the flannel shirts, and eventually a kind of cool retroactive respect. But the people born between 1965 and 1975, sometimes called the tail end of Gen X, sometimes called Xennials, sometimes called nothing at all, got something different. They got the experience of belonging fully to neither world. Old enough to remember a time before the internet changed everything. Young enough to have had to adapt to it completely. Old enough to have grown up without the language of mental health. Young enough to know they needed it. I find this particular kind of in-betweenness deeply interesting psychologically, because the experience of not quite fitting a category is not just a sociological inconvenience. It shapes how you see yourself. It shapes what you expect from the world. And it shapes, in ways that are often invisible, the story you tell about your own life. To understand this generation psychologically, you have to understand what the emotional atmosphere of their childhood actually was. They grew up in households where feelings were not, for the most part, discussed. Not because their parents were cruel, but because their parents had been raised in a world where emotional expression was considered weakness, where you got on with things, where the unspoken rule was, do not make your inner life a burden to others. This was the water these children swam in, and like all water, it was invisible to them. They learned to be competent. They learned to be self-sufficient. They learned to solve problems without asking for help, because asking for help was, in some quiet way, shameful. They learned to read the emotional temperature of a room without being taught to, because no one was going to tell them directly, and they needed to know. I think about this a lot. The generation that grew up being told to toughen up is now in their 50s, navigating a world that has suddenly decided that emotional intelligence is the most important skill a person can have. And many of them are doing the work, quietly, privately, without fanfare, of unlearning everything they were taught about what it means to be strong. That, to me, is not a failure. That is one of the most courageous things a human being can do. There is a concept in psychology called the parentified child. The child who, in the absence of emotionally available parents, becomes the emotional caretaker of the family, who learns to suppress their own needs in order to manage the needs of the adults around them. I am not saying every person born in this generation was a parentified child, but I am saying that the emotional culture they grew up in, the stoicism, the self-sufficiency, the silence around inner life, created conditions where many of them learned very early to put themselves last, to be useful rather than vulnerable, to earn love through doing rather than simply being. And that lesson, once learned, does not stay in childhood. It follows you. It shows up in your relationships, in your work, in the way you respond to your own pain. It shows up as the inability to ask for what you need, as the compulsion to fix things for everyone else while quietly falling apart inside, as the strange guilt that comes with resting, with receiving, with simply existing without producing. If any of this sounds familiar, I want you to hear this clearly. That is not who you are. That is what you were taught. And those are two very different things. There is another layer to this that I think deserves its own space. This generation did not just grow up between emotional eras. They grew up between technological eras. And that transition from an analog childhood to a digital adulthood left a particular kind of mark. They remember what it was like to be unreachable, to go out for the day and simply be gone. No phone, no messages, no notifications. They remember the quality of boredom that preceded the internet, the particular texture of a Saturday afternoon with nothing to do and no screen to fill it. They remember writing letters. They remember waiting. And then, in their 20s and 30s, the world changed completely. And they adapted. They had to. But adaptation is not the same as belonging. Many of them have spent their adult lives fluent in a digital world that was not built for the way their minds were shaped, competent but never quite at home. I think this creates a specific kind of nostalgia, not just for the past, but for a version of themselves that existed before the acceleration. A self that was slower, quieter, more rooted. And I think that nostalgia is worth taking seriously, not as sentimentality, but as information, as the psyche's way of pointing toward something it still needs. This generation is now in their 50s. And midlife, for this particular cohort, looks different than it did for their parents, and different, too, from the midlife crises that popular culture has always loved to mock. Because many of them are not buying sports cars or running away from their lives. They are doing something quieter and, I think, more profound. They are asking questions they were never given permission to ask before. What do I actually want? What have I been carrying that was never mine to carry? What would my life look like if I stopped performing strength and started practicing honesty? These are not small questions, and the fact that so many people in this generation are asking them, often for the first time, often in therapy, often in the middle of the night, tells me something important. It tells me that the work of the inner life does not have an expiration date, that it is never too late to begin. My personal view, and I hold this firmly, is that the people who do this work in midlife, who are willing to sit with the discomfort of becoming more honest with themselves after decades of managing and coping and surviving, are doing some of the bravest psychological work there is. There is no applause for it. There is no cultural narrative that celebrates it. But it is real, and it matters, and it changes things. Not just for them, but for everyone around them. So if you are part of this generation, if you grew up in the gap, if you learned to be strong before you learned to be soft, if you have spent your life being competent and capable and quietly, privately exhausted, here is what I want to say to you. Your timing was not wrong. You were not born too late or too early. You were born exactly when you were. And what you made of that, the adaptability, the resilience, the quiet depth that comes from having lived through more than one version of the world, is not nothing. It is something. The self-sufficiency you were taught was a gift in some ways and a wound in others. You are allowed to acknowledge both. You are allowed to be grateful for the strength it gave you and honest about the cost it carried. Those two things can be true at the same time. And the work you are doing now, the questioning, the unlearning, the slow and sometimes painful process of learning to receive as well as give, that work is not a sign that something went wrong. It is a sign that something is going right, that the part of you that was always there, always waiting, is finally being given the space it deserved all along. If this video felt like something you needed to hear today, if it touched something quiet and real in you, then you are already in the right place. MindGlow exists for exactly this, the conversations that go beneath the surface, that take the inner life seriously. Subscribe, and let's keep exploring together.